Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. Hurricanes, they're a fact of life down here on the Gulf Coast. You learn to respect them, you learn to watch the signs, and you learn to get the heck out of Dodge when they come calling. Most of the time, you get a good few days warning, plenty of time to haul your boat up on blocks, batten down the hatches, and hunker down with some iced tea and wait it out. But this one wasn't like that. This one blew in like a runaway train, sneaky like a thief in the night, and nearly stole my life. It did. It was back, it must have been 98, maybe 99. Can't rightly remember the year, but I remember that day like it was yesterday. Summer was in full swing, hotter than blue blazes, the kind of heat that hangs heavy in the air, makes the cicadas sing louder and slower, and just saps the energy right out of you. But the fishing was good. Oh, Lordy, was it good. Red snapper were biting like crazy, and I was bringing in my limit every trip. Enough to keep the freezer full, sell a bit to old Mrs. Henderson down at the fish market, and still have some left over to share with my neighbors. A good summer, a real good summer. That morning started just like any other. Woke up before the sun. That's the fisherman's way, you know. Gotta beat the heat and beat the crowds. Made myself a strong cup of coffee, black as sin and hot as the hinges of hell, and a couple of slices of toast with some homemade fig, preserves my wife, bless her soul, used to make. She's been gone, well, a good long while now, but her preserves, they still sweeten my mornings. Hopped in my old Ford pickup, that trusty beast, and drove down to the marina. The Salty Dog, that's what I called my boat. A 22-foot Grady White she was. Not fancy, not new, but solid as a rock and seaworthy as they come. She'd seen me through a lot, that boat. We were partners, me and the Salty Dog. Always looked after each other. Got down to the dock. The air was still cool then, just starting to get that humid edge to it. The sky was clear as a bell, not a cloud in sight. Sun just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Sea was flat calm, like a sheet of glass reflecting the dawn. Perfect fishing weather. Couldn't have asked for better. I untied her lines, fired up the engine, that old reliable purr, and idled out of the no-wake zone. Headed out towards my favorite snapper spot, about 30 miles offshore. Out there you get away from the crowds, and the fish are always bigger, tastier too, I swear. The trip out was smooth as butter, just the gentle rocking of the boat, the smell of salt air, and the sound of the engine humming. Seagulls crying overhead, dolphins playing in the wake. Days like that, you feel like you're living in a postcard, like nothing could ever go wrong. Got to my spot, dropped anchor, and got to work. Baited my hooks with some squid, dropped my lines, and bam, almost instant bite. Pulled up a nice chunky red snapper, bright red and feisty as could be. Grinned like a fool. This was going to be a good day, I thought. And it was for a while. Fish were jumping in the boat. The sun was climbing higher, warming my back, and I was whistling along to some old country tune on the radio. Felt like I was on top of the world. Had about half my limit in the cooler already, and it wasn't even 10 in the morning. Then things started to change. Subtle at first, like a whisper in the wind before the storm. I noticed the wind picking up a little. Just a slight breeze, hardly anything to worry about. But it felt different, colder somehow, and it shifted direction. Started coming from the north, which was unusual for that time of year. Normally the summer winds blow in off the Gulf, warm and moist. Looked up at the sky, still blue overhead, but towards the north, over the land. There was a haze starting to gather, kind of a grayish, yellowish haze. Didn't look like rain clouds, not yet. More like something brewing. Ignored it for a bit. Figured it was just some afternoon thunderstorms rolling in early. Happens sometimes. But the wind kept picking up, and the haze was getting thicker, darker. The sea, which had been so calm, started to get a little chop to it. Just little whitecaps, but still. The radio started acting funny. Static creeping in, drowning out the music. Tried switching channels, see if I could get a weather report. Nothing but static and garbled voices. That's when a little prickle of unease started to creep up my spine. Then the birds went quiet. Seagulls stopped crying, just disappeared. Dolphins vanished too. The whole ocean seemed to hold its breath. And the wind. Lord, that wind was starting to howl now. No longer a breeze. This was a proper wind, pushing the boat around, making it harder to hold my position. Looked up at the sky again. The haze had swallowed up the blue. The whole sky was this sickly gray-yellow color now, and it was moving fast, rushing in from the north like a freight train. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a thunderstorm. This was something else, something bad. Hurricane, I said out loud to myself, the word catching in my throat. Couldn't believe it. Hurricanes don't just pop up like this, not without warning. We always get days to prepare. But looking at that sky, feeling that wind, I knew, in my gut, this was a hurricane, and it was coming right for me. Panic started to set in, but I pushed it down. Years of fishing, years of dealing with rough seas, kicked in. Had to stay calm, had to think. First thing, haul anchor. Couldn't stay anchored in this. Boat would get swamped for sure. Started cranking that anchor winch. Wind was screaming now. Rain starting to spit, stinging my face. Waves were getting bigger, choppier, tossing the boat around like a cork. Took forever to get that anchor up, felt like. Every muscle in my arms screaming. Finally got it aboard, stowed it as best I could, and scrambled back to the helm. Engine roaring now. Pointed the boat into the wind, trying to keep her steady. Needed to head back to shore, and fast. But shore felt 1,000,000 miles away. The storm hit then, not gradually, not with a slow build-up. Just bam, like a giant fist slamming down on the ocean. Wall of rain hit first, blinding, torrential. Couldn't see a thing. Then the wind, a solid wall of air, like hitting a brick wall at full speed. Knocked the breath right out of me. Waves exploded around the boat, huge monstrous things, rising up like mountains, then crashing down with a roar. The salty dog was tossed around like a toy, up one wave, down another, sideways, every which way, but loose, lost all sense of direction. Just hanging on for dear life, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, fighting to keep the boat pointed into the waves. Engine screaming, straining, but barely making headway against the wind and waves. Rain was coming down so hard, it was like being underwater, even above deck. Couldn't see, couldn't hear, just the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, and the shuddering of the boat. Thought for sure she was going to break apart. Right then and there. Waves kept getting bigger, meaner. One minute I was staring up at a wall of water 20 feet high. The next I was plunging down into a trough so deep it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Water was pouring over the sides, filling the cockpit. Bilge pump was working overtime, but it was a losing battle. Tried to call for help on the radio again, but it was useless. Just static and crackling. Lost contact with everyone. Alone out there in the middle of the storm. Just me and the salty dog against the full fury of nature. Time lost all meaning. Could have been hours. Could have been minutes. Felt like an eternity. Just fighting, struggling, trying to survive. Every wave felt like it was going to be the one to flip the boat, to send me to the bottom. Fear was a constant companion, gnawing at my insides, whispering that this was the end. Remember looking out through the driving rain and seeing something big and dark looming through the waves. Thought it was another monstrous wave, but then it got closer, and I realized it was a ship, a big cargo ship, wallowing in the storm, just as helpless as I was, but a whole lot bigger. Scared me even more seeing that thing. Made me realize just how small I was, how insignificant, out here in the face of this storm, like an ant facing a bulldozer. Kept fighting, kept trying to steer, kept pumping the bilge, kept praying, prayed to God, prayed to my wife, prayed to anyone who might be listening, just begging for it to stop, begging for a break. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it started to ease. Wind didn't howl quite so loud. Rain didn't fall quite so hard. Waves, still big, still rough, but not quite so monstrous. Like the storm was taking a breath. Held my breath too, not daring to believe it, but it kept easing. Wind died down a bit more. Rain turned to a drizzle, then stopped altogether. Clouds started to break up, and through the gaps I saw blue sky, just patches of it, but blue sky nonetheless. Sun even peeked through for a moment, weak and watery, but still, the sun. Felt like I hadn't seen the sun in days, or maybe it had only been hours. Didn't matter. The storm was passing. The sea was still a mess, waves still big and confused. But the worst was over. Engine was still running, thank God. Boat was battered, bruised, cockpit full of water, but she was afloat. We'd made it. We'd survived. Sat there for a long time after the storm passed, just catching my breath, letting the adrenaline drain away, shaking like a leaf, cold and wet and exhausted, but alive. That was all that mattered. Alive. Slowly, cautiously, I turned the salty dog toward shore. Trip back was slow, careful. Waves were still kicking up, and the boat was riding low with all the water in it. But the sun was coming out stronger now, warming my face, drying my clothes. Saw other boats out there, coming out of hiding, blinking in the sunlight like newborn calves. Everyone looking around, taking stock of the damage, the aftermath. We'd all been through it. We'd all survived. Finally limped back into port. Folks were there on the docks, waiting, worried, sick. Saw my buddy, old Billy, waving his arms, yelling my name. He ran down as I tied up, face all pale and drawn. "Jerry, you all right? We thought you were a goner." I just grinned, weak and shaky, and said, "Like a bad penny, Billy. Always turn up again." He slapped me on the back hard enough to make me cough, but it felt good. Felt good to be back on solid ground, felt good to be alive, felt good to be among friends. Later we found out what happened. That storm, they called it a freak storm, formed out of nowhere, strengthened over warm water in record time, and slammed into the coast with hardly any warning. Caught everyone by surprise. Some folks weren't so lucky. Lost boats, lost homes. Some even lost their lives. But me and the salty dog, we made it. Learned a lesson that day, let me tell you. Respect the sea. Always respect the sea. You think you know it. You think you've seen it all. And then something like that comes along and reminds you just how small you really are. Still go fishing, you know. Can't keep an old fisherman away from the water. But I'm a whole lot more careful now. I watch the skies. I listen to the weather reports. And if there's even a whisper of trouble, I head for shore. Ain't no fish worth going through that again. Not for all the tea in China. Hope you're ready, 'cause this next story's got a pull to it. Just like a big one on the line. Let's get to it. Now I was probably, maybe 55, 56 years old at the time. Still had a good bit of salt left in my beard, but the years were starting to show. But my boat, the Sea Serpent, she was still chugging along, faithful as ever. I'd had her for over 30 years, and she knew the waters of the Gulf of Mexico better than I knew the back of my hand. It was a scorcher of a July morning, the kind that makes the air shimmer like a mirage. The sun was already beaten down hard by 6, and the humidity was thick enough you could chew on it. I remember wiping the sweat off my brow as I pulled out of the harbor in Biloxi, the Sea Serpent groaning a little as she got underway. I was after red snapper that day, a good mess of them to sell down at the market. I'd been having decent luck, but I was hoping for a real haul. Bait was fresh, tackle was ready, and I had a cooler full of ice. I was set. I headed out to my usual spot, about 20 miles offshore, where the reef dropped off sharp. The GPS coordinates were burned into my memory after all these years. I eased the anchor down, hooked up my line with some cut mullet, and waited. Regular as clockwork. The snapper started biting. I was pulling him in pretty steady for a couple of hours. Nothing huge, mind you. Mostly 2, 3-pounders, but enough to make it worth my while. The sun climbed higher, the air got stickier, and the snapper started to slow down. I figured they'd gone deeper to escape the heat. That's when I decided to change things up. I figured I'd troll around a bit, maybe see if I could snag a king mackerel or 2. They like to cruise around those reef edges, chasing bait fish. So I pulled up the anchor, cranked up the engine, and started to motor slowly along the edge of the reef, dragging a couple of lures behind me. Now I'd caught my share of mackerel, and even a few wahoo over the years, but I'd always dreamed of catching a marlin. They were the kings of the Gulf, majestic creatures that could fight like hell. I'd seen pictures, heard stories, but never had one on the line. Honestly, I figured I never would. I was just about to give up on the trolling idea and head back to my original spot when it happened. The reel on my heavy-duty rod, the one I usually used for sharks, started screaming like a banshee. That wasn't no mackerel. That was something big. I grabbed the rod, and the force nearly ripped it out of my hands. Whatever was on the other end was pulling like a freight train. The Sea Serpent started to list to one side, as the line screamed off the reel. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Easy does it, Jerry. Don't get too excited." I adjusted the drag, trying to find that sweet spot between letting the fish run and putting too much pressure on the line. I knew that if I clamped down too hard, it would snap. But if I let it run too much, it would spool me. The fight was on. For the first few minutes, all I could do was hold on. This thing was just taking line, heading out to open water like it owned the place. I could feel the power in every jerk and pull. It was an exhilarating, terrifying feeling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fish started to slow down a little. I started to gradually reel in some line, gaining a few feet with each turn of the handle. It was slow, agonizing work. My arms burned, my back ached, and sweat poured down my face. I finally managed to get a little bit of the line back, and then the fish jumped. It breached the surface of the water in a spectacular display of power, silver and black scales glinting in the sunlight. I could see its long, spear-like bill and its massive size. It was a marlin, and not just any marlin. This was a monster. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," I whispered. "That's a damn blue one." Now, I knew I was in for a fight. A marlin like that wasn't going to give up easy. I settled in for the long haul, knowing that this could take hours. As I fought the marlin, I started to think about everything I knew about them. I knew they were apex predators, built for speed and power. I knew they were solitary creatures, roaming the oceans in search of food. I knew they were a symbol of the wild, untamed beauty of the sea. I also knew that they were in trouble. Overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction were threatening their survival. It made me think about what I was doing too. Here I am, this old man trying to catch one of these things. I started to question myself. Should I really be doing this? Was it worth the risk? To the fish? To myself? Just for the thrill of the fight? But then the marlin would surge again, pulling me back to the present moment, back to the battle. I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to focus on what I was doing. Hour after hour, the fight went on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat grew more intense, and my muscles burned with exhaustion. But I refused to give up. I was determined to see this thing through to the end, one way or another. Sometimes the marlin would run, taking out hundreds of yards of line. Other times it would sound, diving deep into the depths. And then it would jump again, a breathtaking display of raw power. Each time it jumped, it tested my resolve, pushing me to my limits. I drank water, ate a bit of a sandwich, and kept fighting. I knew I had to stay hydrated and keep my energy up if I wanted to have any chance of winning this battle. As the hours passed, I started to feel a strange connection to the marlin. I respected its strength, its tenacity, its will to survive. I also felt a sense of guilt. I was trying to kill something that was so magnificent, so powerful, so vital to the ocean ecosystem. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to get sentimental. I was in the middle of a fight, and I had to focus on winning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the marlin started to tire. His runs became shorter, his jumps less frequent. I could feel that I was gaining the upper hand. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to reel it in, inch by inch. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I kept going. I knew that if I gave up now, I would never forgive myself. As the marlin got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was even bigger than I had imagined. It was a magnificent creature with shimmering silver scales, a long pointed bill, and powerful, graceful fins. When I finally got it close enough to the boat, I reached for my gaff. But then I hesitated. I looked into the marlin's eye, and I saw something there, a kind of ancient wisdom, a quiet understanding of the natural world. In that moment, something changed in me. I realized that I couldn't kill this fish. It wasn't about the trophy, or the bragging rights, or the money. It was about respect, about honoring the life of this incredible creature. So I did something that surprised even myself. I lowered the gaff, reached for my knife, and cut the line. The marlin paused for a moment, as if surprised by my actions. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the depths. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where the marlin had disappeared. I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhilaration. I had lost the fight, but I had won something more important. I had honored my own conscience. I reeled in the line, stowed my gear, and started the engine. As I headed back to shore, I couldn't stop smiling. I had a story to tell, a story about the one that got away, a story about respect and the wildness of the sea. Now the story doesn't quite finish there. When I got back to Biloxi, word about my encounter with the marlin had already spread like wildfire. Fishermen, dock workers, and even some tourists gathered around the sea serpent to hear my tale. They were all amazed by the size of the fish, and they were even more amazed by what I did, or rather what I didn't do. "You cut the line?" one of the fishermen asked, incredulous. "After all that fighting? You must be crazy, Jerry." I just shrugged. "Maybe I am," I said, "but I couldn't do it. It just didn't feel right." Some of them shook their heads, but others nodded in understanding. They knew what it was like to feel a connection to the sea, to respect the creatures that lived there. That night, I went down to the local bar, the Salty Dog, where all the fishermen hung out. As soon as I walked in, everyone started to cheer. "Jerry! Jerry! Jerry!" they chanted. The owner of the bar, Maggie, a tough old woman who knew her way around a fishing boat, came over and gave me a hug. "You're a legend, Jerry," she said. "You showed them all what it means to be a true fisherman." She bought me a beer, and I sat down at the bar, surrounded by my friends and colleagues. We talked about the marlin, about the fight, about the decision I made. As I sat there listening to their stories and their laughter, I realized that I had done the right thing. I had stayed true to myself, and I had earned the respect of my community. But the real reward came a few weeks later. I was out fishing again, trolling along the same reef where I had encountered the marlin. I was hoping to catch a few king mackerel, but I wasn't expecting much. Suddenly I saw something in the distance, a flash of silver, a swirl of water. It was a marlin, and it was heading straight towards my boat. As it got closer, I could see that it was the same marlin I had fought weeks before. I recognized the distinctive markings on its side, the scars from previous battles. The marlin swam right up to the sea serpent and circled the boat a few times. It looked at me with its big, wise eyes, as if to say thank you. Then, with a graceful flick of its tail, it swam away, disappearing into the depths once again. I sat there for a long time, watching the spot where it had disappeared. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude. I knew that I had been blessed, that I had been given a gift. From that day on, I never looked at fishing the same way again. I still loved the challenge, the excitement, the thrill of the catch. But I also had a deeper appreciation for the beauty and the fragility of the ocean ecosystem. I started practicing catch and release more, and I took greater care to minimize my impact on the environment. And every time I went out to that reef, I always looked for that marlin. I never saw it again, but I knew that it was out there, swimming free, a symbol of the wild, untamed spirit of the sea. Y'all hang tight. I ain't done yet. Just gotta let this next story settle in my mind like a good cast sitting in the water. I'll be right back, and when I do, you best believe it'll be worth the wait. Well, let me tell you about the summer of the snapper, as me and the boys used to call it. Must have been, Lord, time flies like a hummingbird in a hurricane. Must have been back in, let's see, must have been around 30-something, maybe 34, 35. Still had a full head of hair then, and my back didn't creak like this old porch swing every time I stood up. Yeah, 30-something. That was a hot summer, hot and heavy down here in Louisiana. The kind of heat that sticks to you like a wet shirt and saps the energy right out of you before you even pour your first cup of coffee. The Gulf, though, that was always a little bit cooler, a little bit of a breath of fresh air, even steamy as it could get. That year, the red snapper were running thicker than fleas on a hound dog in July. You could practically walk across the water on their backs, or so it seemed. Every fisherman for miles around was out there chasing them, myself included. I had my boat back then, the Salty Dog, a sturdy old girl she was, built for these waters. Not fancy, mind you, but reliable as the sunrise and twice as ornery when she didn't want to start. Anyway, me and my buddy, Dale. Poor Dale. He's gone on to the big fishing hole in the sky now. We decided we were going to make a killing that summer. Snapper were bringing a good price at the market, and we were both young and, maybe a little too full of ourselves. We thought we were the kings of the Gulf, knew everything there was to know about fishing. Youthful arrogance, that's a powerful current, stronger than any tide. We'd head out before sunrise, chugging out past the breakers, further than most folks were willing to go. We knew about a few spots, old reefs and wrecks that held snapper like nobody's business. And we were catching them, oh Lord, were we catching them? Big old beauties, crimson red, fighting like they had a personal vendetta against your fishing rod. Our boat would be loaded down by midday, near sinking sometimes. We packed them in so tight. We were greedy, plain and simple, chasing the money, chasing the glory of the biggest catch, the most fish. We weren't thinking about much else. Not the beauty of the sunrise over the water, not the way the dolphins would play in our wake, not even the simple pleasure of just being out there on the Gulf. Just fish, 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 and more fish. One day, we were out further than usual. Dale had heard tell of a new wreck, way out past the 20-mile mark, supposed to be swarming with snapper the size of dinner plates. Now, usually I was a bit more cautious, stuck closer to what I knew. But Dale, he was always the adventurous one, pushing the boundaries, and the lure of those big snapper, it was too strong to resist. So we went, chugged and chugged further and further out. The water got deeper, darker blue, almost black. We reached the coordinates Dale had, and sure enough, the fish finder lit up like a Christmas tree. Schools of snapper, thick as thieves, all around that wreck. For a while it was heaven for a fisherman. Drop your line, bam. Fish on. Reel it in. Another big snapper. We were pulling them up one after another. Barely had time to rebait our hooks. The sun beat down. Sweat dripped off our noses. But we didn't care. We were in fishing paradise. But then the wind started to pick up. Just a little breeze at first, nothing much. But then it got stronger and stronger. The sky started to turn a funny color, kind of a bruised purple-gray. I looked to the east, and I saw it, a line of dark clouds, low and angry, coming at us fast. "Dale," I said. "I don't like the look of that." Dale, he was busy hauling in a snapper that must have weighed 10 pounds, all muscle and fight. "Relax, Jerry," he said, grinning. "Just a little squall. We've seen worse." Maybe we had, but something felt different about this one. The air felt heavy, electric almost. The waves were starting to chop up, the boat rocking harder. "Dale, we need to head back," I said, my voice getting a little sharper. "Now." He finally looked up, took a look at the sky, and his grin faded. "Yeah," he said, "maybe you're right." We started to pull up our lines, reel in our gear, but the storm was coming on fast. Faster than we could have imagined. By the time we got the anchor up and the salty dog pointed back toward shore, the wind hit us full force. It was like a giant hand smacking us sideways. Waves jumped up, big and angry, spraying over the bow, soaking us to the bone in an instant. The sky turned black as pitch, and the rain started. Not a gentle rain, but a torrential downpour, stinging our faces like buckshot. Visibility dropped to nothing. We couldn't see shore, couldn't see anything but the angry gray water and the wall of rain. The salty dog was tossing and turning like a cork in a bathtub. Waves were crashing over the sides, filling the boat with water. The engine was screaming, trying to power us through the storm, but it felt like we were hardly making any headway. Fear, real fear, started to creep into my gut. I'd been in storms before, plenty of them, but nothing like this. This was a monster, a Gulf rage, unleashed. Dale, for all his bravado, was looking pale. "Think we're in trouble, Jerry?" he yelled over the roar of the wind and waves. "We're in deep trouble, Dale," I yelled back. "Deep trouble indeed." We fought. We fought the storm, fought to keep the boat pointed into the waves, fought to keep the engine running, fought to bail out the water that kept pouring in. Years of experience, years of fishing in these waters, that's what saved us. Instinct took over. Every wave, every gust of wind, I reacted, adjusted, fought back. Dale, too. He was a good man in a crisis, no doubt about it. Time lost all meaning. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes, seemed like a lifetime. The storm raged on, relentless, merciless. We were tossed around like toys, battered and bruised, cold and soaked to the bone. I remember thinking more than once, this is it. This is how it ends. Out here in the middle of the Gulf, swallowed by the storm, for chasing after a pile of fish. And then just as suddenly as it began, it started to ease. The wind began to die down. The rain slowed to a drizzle. The waves started to flatten out. The sky, still dark gray, started to show hints of light peeking through. Slowly, painstakingly, The storm retreated. Like some wild beast, it had roared and raged, and then, just as capriciously, it decided to move on, leaving us battered and shaken in its wake. When the clouds finally broke for good, the sun peeked through, weak and watery, but still the sun. The sea was still rough, choppy, but it wasn't the raging monster it had been. We looked around. We were still afloat. The salty dog was battered, beat up, waterlogged, but she was still riding the waves. We were alive, beat up, scared half to death, but alive. We didn't say much for a while, just sat there, exhausted, breathing heavy, the smell of salt and rain thick in the air. We slowly started to take stock. The boat was a mess, gear tossed everywhere. Some of it washed overboard, I'm sure. The fish, well, all those snapper we'd caught, our bounty, our prize, all washed overboard in the storm. Every single one. We'd lost everything, except we'd gained something too. Something more important than a boatload of fish or a pile of money. We gained a new appreciation, an appreciation for the power of the sea, the unpredictability of nature, and the sheer dumb luck of being alive. Slowly, we limped the salty dog back toward shore. The engine was sputtering and coughing, but it kept running. The trip felt like it took forever. Every wave, every creak of the boat was a reminder of what we'd just been through. We finally made it back to the harbor late that night. The other fishermen were there, waiting, worried sick. They'd seen the storm coming in, and they knew we were way out there. When they saw us pull in, battered but whole, they let out a cheer that echoed across the water. They helped us tie up the salty dog, helped us ashore, offered us food, warm drinks, dry clothes. They didn't ask about the fish, didn't ask about our catch. They just were glad to see us alive. That night, sitting by the fire in the fishing shack, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot coffee, Dale and me, we finally started to talk. Not about the storm itself, not really, but about what it meant, about what we'd learned. You know, Dale said, staring into the flames. We were getting too greedy, Jerry, too focused on the catch, not on the sea itself. I nodded. Yeah, I said. We forgot to respect her. Forgot she's got a temper. We sat there in silence for a while, just listening to the crackle of the fire and the gentle lapping of the waves outside. And then Dale said something that stuck with me, something I've never forgotten. Maybe, he said, maybe the sea, she took our fish to teach us a lesson, to remind us who's really in charge out here. And you know what? I think he was right. That storm, that summer of the snapper storm, it took more than just our fish that day. It took our arrogance. It stripped us bare, showed us just how small and insignificant we really are in the face of nature's power. We went back fishing, of course, Dale and me. We were fishermen. It's in our blood. But something had changed in us. We didn't chase after the biggest catch quite so hard anymore. We paid more attention to the signs of the sea, learned to respect her moods, her rhythms. We appreciated the beauty of the sunrise, the dance of the dolphins, the simple joy of being out there on the water. We still caught fish, plenty of them, but we understood then that the real bounty wasn't just in the fish we brought back to shore. It was in the whole experience, the challenge, the beauty, the danger, the peace. It was in the connection to something bigger than ourselves. So that's my story, son, or ma'am. The summer of the snapper storm. lost a boatload of fish, almost lost our lives, but gained something more valuable in the process. Learned a lesson about respect, about humility, about the real treasures in life. The sea, she's a hard teacher, but she's a fair one. And sometimes the greatest catches ain't the ones you bring back to shore. Sometimes they're the lessons you learn out there, fighting the storms of life. I was just sitting here, remembering another time out on the water, and I figured, why keep it to myself? Let me tell you all about it. The salt hung thick in the air that day, just clinging to you like a second skin. I reckon it was late August, the kind where the sun beats down on the Gulf like a blacksmith's hammer, making the water shimmer and dance. Debbie, bless her heart, was back at the cabin, probably fussing over her begonias and getting ready for the next wave of travelers. I, on the other hand, was out there, me and my trusty boat, the salty dog, chasing the ever-elusive red drum. Now I've hooked a lot of red drum in my time, some real monsters, but this particular day felt different. It felt charged, like the air itself was humming with anticipation. I remember feeling an unusual calmness, a stillness that settled over me, like the morning mist over the bayou. Usually I'd be fidgeting, checking my lines, fussing with my bait. But that day, I just let the boat drift, the rhythm of the waves rocking me into a peaceful trance. I wasn't using any fancy gear that day, just my old reliable rod, the one with the slightly worn cork grip, a simple weighted hook, and a chunk of fresh mullet. I've always been a believer in the power of simplicity, letting the fish do the talking, so to speak. Hours passed, and the sun started sinking, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A few smaller fish had nipped at my bait, but nothing of real interest. I was content, though, just enjoying the quiet solitude of the sea. Then it happened. The rod bent over like a willow in a hurricane. Not a sharp, jarring tug, but a slow, powerful pull, like something enormous had decided to explore the depths with my line. My heart jumped into my throat, and that calm I'd been feeling turned into a thrill that ran right down to my toes. I knew, in that instant, this was no ordinary fish. I set the hook, and the fight began, a battle of wills between man and beast that played out under the fading light. This wasn't a quick, erratic fight. It was slow, deliberate, the fish pulling me one way, me giving a little, then taking some line back. It felt like I was wrestling a submerged log, an ancient leviathan that had seen centuries of the ocean's secrets. Sweat beaded on my brow as I fought the fish. My arms ached, my back was screaming, but I couldn't give up. Not now. This wasn't just about catching a fish anymore. It was about something deeper, something primal. It was about the connection between a fisherman and the sea, a respect for the power that lay beneath the surface. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and I was fighting under the soft glow of the moon. The stars started to appear, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. I couldn't see the fish yet, but I could feel its immense power, its resilience. I started to think I might lose, but something deep inside me wouldn't let me quit. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a flash of silver in the moonlight, then another. I could make out the broad, powerful tail thrashing in the water as the fish broke the surface, its copper scales gleaming. It was the biggest red drum I'd ever seen, a true specimen, easily 70, maybe 80 pounds, maybe more. It looked like it could swallow my smallest dog whole. Slowly, carefully, I began to reel it in, the boat rocking with the strain. It was a delicate dance, a give and take, each movement calculated. I kept a steady hand, knowing that one wrong twitch could snap the line, or worse, break my heart. Finally, after what seemed like days, I managed to get the fish alongside the boat. I could see it clearly now, its big, soulful eye looking back at me. Now some might say I was foolish, but instead of pulling him aboard, something made me pause. I just stared at him, mesmerized. There he was, majestic and strong. I remember thinking about how many years he'd been swimming those currents, witnessing the ever-changing tides. I felt a profound respect for him, a kinship that went beyond the usual fisherman's pride. It was like I was seeing a part of myself reflected in his ancient eyes, a connection to the deeper rhythms of the universe that we all sometimes tend to forget. In that moment, the thrill of the catch faded. I knew that pulling him into the boat, taking him away from his home, just didn't feel right. So I did something I never usually do. I took my knife and carefully cut the line. I watched as the red drum paused for a moment, then, with a flick of its powerful tail, disappeared back into the darkness, sinking into the depths from whence he came. The line went slack, and the silence that followed felt both empty and profound. Now, most of the fellas from the docks would have called me a fool. They might have even laughed. Why would I release a fish like that? I could have bragged about it for years, but I didn't care. The memory of that encounter, that silent understanding between man and fish, was worth more than any trophy I could ever hang above my mantle. I pulled in my line, packed up my gear, and headed back to shore. Debbie was waiting for me, a worried look on her face, but I just smiled and told her, "I caught a big one, Debs, the biggest one I've ever seen." She asked how big in pounds, and I told her. "Oh dear," she said, "that would have been a great feast for the travelers." I just chuckled and said, "But this one, Debs, I'll remember forever." And you know what? I still remember it like it was yesterday. The salt, the sweat, the fight, the gentle release. That's the thing about fishing, friend. It's not just about the catch. It's about the journey. It's about the moments of quiet contemplation, the connection with nature, and sometimes it's about the ones that got away. And that, my friend, is a story I'll carry with me until the day the tide takes me away. Now, how about another glass of tea? All right now, y'all settle in, 'cause I got another tale for you. This one's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while, just waiting for the right time to be told. It was back in 82, maybe 83. Lord, time flies like gnats on a summer evening. I was still a young feller then, full of vinegar and the need to prove myself. My daddy, bless his soul, had taught me everything he knew about fish in the Gulf, but I was restless, always looking for something bigger, something legendary. The whispers started in the docks down in Biloxi. Fishermen talk, you know, always exaggerating, always trying to outdo each other. But this was different. This wasn't just tavern talk. This was hushed tones and nervous eyes, talk of a monster grouper, They called him Old Leviathan. Now I'd caught my share of big grouper over the years, 100-pounders, maybe even a touch more. But this was different. They said Old Leviathan was different. They said he lived out past the continental shelf, in a spot where the water was dark as ink and the pressure could crush a submarine. They said he was bigger than a Volkswagen, with eyes like dinner plates and a mouth that could swallow a man whole. Most folks dismissed it as fisherman's lore, a tall tale spun to scare the tourists. But something about the way they talked about him, the fear in their voices, it stuck with me. It got under my skin like chiggers in July. I couldn't shake it. So I started doing my research. I pored over charts, studied the currents, talked to divers who'd gone out that far. Most just laughed in my face, told me I was chasing a ghost. But a few, the ones I trusted, they admitted they'd heard the rumors too. They'd seen things out there, strange readings on their sonar, unexplained shadows in the deep. I had a boat back then, a 28-foot Bertram, named her the Wanderer. She was a sturdy girl, built for the open water. I spent weeks getting her ready, reinforced the hull, upgraded the sonar, rigged up a heavy-duty winch that could haul a small car out of the ocean, and I started preparing my tackle. Now, you gotta understand, regular grouper fishing gear ain't gonna cut it with something like Old Leviathan. I'm talking about thick braided line, strong enough to tow a truck, hooks forged from hardened steel, and a rod that felt like holding a telephone pole. I even had a custom-made lure built, a giant articulated sardine, painted with luminescent paint to attract attention in the deep. My wife, bless her heart, thought I was losing my mind. She'd say, "Jerry, you're going to get yourself killed chasing that fish. Leave it alone. It's just a story." But I couldn't. The idea of Old Leviathan had burrowed its way into my soul. I had to know if he was real. Finally, the day came. The weather was perfect. Calm seas, clear skies, and a gentle breeze blowing off the Gulf. I packed the Wanderer with enough fuel, food, and water to last a week. I kissed my wife goodbye, told her I loved her, and pointed the Wanderer's bow towards the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun beat down, the engine hummed, and the water stretched out in every direction, an endless expanse of blue. As I got further from shore, the other boats disappeared. It was just me, the Wanderer, and the open ocean. Then I hit the spot. The coordinates I'd painstakingly calculated from the charts and the divers' reports. The bottom dropped off sharply, plunging into what felt like another world. The water turned a deep, forbidding blue, almost black. The sonar screen lit up with jagged peaks and valleys, indicating a complex underwater landscape. I cut the engine and let the Wanderer drift. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was the creak of the hull and the distant cries of gulls. I took a deep breath, said a little prayer, and lowered my line. The weight of the lure and the sinker pulled the line taut. It felt like I was lowering a small anchor. I watched the line spool out, counting the meters as they ticked off on the counter. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. The water was getting colder, darker. Finally, at 300 meters, the line stopped. I was on the bottom. I engaged the reel and started jigging the lure, trying to attract some attention. I waited. Nothing. Just the feel of the current tugging at the line. I waited another hour. Still nothing. Doubt started to creep into my mind. Maybe my wife was right. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. Maybe old Leviathan was just a myth, but I couldn't give up. Not yet. I adjusted my position slightly and tried again. This time I let the lure sit on the bottom for a longer period, hoping to pique the interest of anything that might be lurking nearby. Then it happened. The rod bent double. It was like hitting a brick wall. The line screamed off the reel. I grabbed the rod with both hands, braced my feet against the deck, and held on for dear life. Whatever was on the other end was powerful, incredibly powerful. It was pulling the Wanderer sideways, like she was nothing more than a toy boat. I tightened the drag on the reel, but it didn't seem to make a difference. The line kept screaming out. My arms were aching, my back was burning, and my knuckles were white. I knew that if this thing kept running at this pace, I was going to get spooled. And once that line snapped, whatever was down there would be gone forever. I had to do something. Slowly, carefully, I started to gain some ground. Inch by inch, I cranked the reel, fighting against the immense weight and power on the other end. My muscles screamed in protest, but I refused to give in. For what felt like an eternity, it was a battle of wills. Me against this thing. The sun started to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The air grew cooler, and the sea became even darker. Finally, after what felt like hours, I started to see some progress. The runs became shorter, the pulls less violent. I was gaining line. I knew I was getting close. Then I saw it. On the sonar screen, a massive shape appeared. It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. It dwarfed the Wanderer. It was old Leviathan. My heart pounded in my chest. I was terrified, but I was also exhilarated. I had found him. The legend was real. Slowly, painstakingly, I brought him closer to the surface. The strain on the line was incredible. I could feel the heat of the reel burning against my fingers. Then he broke the surface. The sight of him took my breath away. He was enormous. His body was a mottled brown and gray, covered in barnacles and scars. His eyes were huge, like ancient knowing orbs. His mouth was a cavernous maw, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. He looked at me, or at least I thought he did. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but I felt a connection, a sense of awe and respect. This was an ancient creature, a survivor. He had seen things I couldn't even imagine. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, me and old Leviathan. Then he did something unexpected. He just stopped fighting. He hung there, suspended in the water, his massive body barely moving. I loosened the drag on the reel and let him rest. I knew that I could probably reel him in, get him close enough to the boat to take a picture, maybe even try to tag him. But something told me not to. I looked at him, at his ancient eyes, at his scarred body. I realized that I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need to conquer him. I just needed to know that he was real. So I did the only thing that felt right. I cut the line. The lure, the hook, the leader, all drifted away, sinking back into the depths. Old Leviathan turned slowly and disappeared back into the darkness. I sat there for a long time after that, staring at the empty ocean. The sun had set completely, and the stars had started to come out. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull of the Wanderer. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had found what I was looking for, not in the fish itself, but in the journey, in the challenge, in the knowledge that there are still mysteries out there, hidden in the depths of the ocean. I started the engine and turned the wanderer towards home. The journey back was long and uneventful, but I wasn't the same man who had left. I had seen old Leviathan, and I had learned something about myself in the process. I never told anyone the full story. Most folks wouldn't have believed me anyway. They would have said I was crazy or lying or just plain old making it up. But that's all right. The memory is enough. It's a story that only I know the full truth of. The Wanderer's hull had some damage over the years and ended up being sold for scraps, but it all paid off. That fishing adventure gave me a lifetime worth of stories to tell. Well, now, I sure hope y'all enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed telling them. Ain't nothing better than sitting back, swapping tales, and feeling like we're all out on the water together. I'll be back tomorrow, same as always, with another one for you. Maybe something that'll have you smelling the bayou air or feeling that tug on the line, like you're right there with me. Till then, y'all rest easy, keep your spirits high, and don't forget, the best stories are the ones we carry with us. See y'all soon, and please feel free to sit back and enjoy the sounds of nature.